Welcome to Money Talks. I'm Genevieve Westcott with your latest financial news from across New Zealand and around the globe. Coming up, who's to blame for that PSA disease turned disaster that's crippled our kiwi fruit industry? The biosecurity botch, lessons learned or lost? Is agriculture the real winner with the government's amendments to New Zealand's emissions trading scheme announced last week? And what does Westland's change to milk pricing tell us? All this and much, much more, starting with biosecurity and that damning independent report into PSA, which has devastated our kiwi fruit industry. Joining us today is KPMG Agribusiness partner Ian Proudfoot. Ian, what's your reaction to that report?
Oh, it was a tough report, wasn't it? It didn't hold any punches, and I suppose it gave a message very clearly that the industry's been wanting to get to the government that biosecurity is a bottom line, and maintaining that level of biosecurity is absolutely critical.
Let's talk at length now about this report. Let me read you some of the things that came out of it. Biosecurity at the border was substandard and deficient. Conducted by a Ministry for Primary Industries out of touch with industry, simply didn't understand the risks. This is incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, bringing pollen into the country clearly carries a high degree of risk, and it does seem there were some pretty relaxed processes around the testing of that pollen, and also checking to where the pollen was coming from. I think, with PSA, I've had the view for some time that the threat was very clear to New Zealand. It was present in Italy, and we knew about that.
And we knew about it in 2009.
Yeah, it's been present in China, and it was known about there as well. So it was an obvious threat to our kiwi fruit industry. What we didn't do, in my view, is we didn't invest in advance of the curve in terms of understanding how PSA could get here. And I think that's our biggest risk to biosecurity, not just of the kiwi fruit sector, but of the whole primary sector. We don't invest enough in understanding where the threat's going to come from.
And what worries me is what the report referred to as a climate of complacency from not only researchers, industry people, but also government officials. Everybody assumed everybody else was taking care of business.
Yeah, and we're seeing that complacency elsewhere in the last sort of 12 months. The classic example is the strawberry growing kits that the warehouse brought in from China, which just waltzed through the border, it appears, without very many checks at all. And suddenly we've got soil and seeds that have come in from China and could have been mixed into our environment. So, I think we have been a little bit lax in some areas, and I think, the agribusiness agenda that we released a few weeks ago made it very clear industry leaders view biosecurity as their #1 priority. And we need to invest in actually understanding where the threat's coming from, because if we're proactive, we don't need to spend the money being reactive down the track.
Yeah, and you're going to pay the money one way or the other. The direct cost to the kiwi fruit industry recently has been put at something like $410 million over the next 5 years at least. So you might save in advance, but do you save long run?
Well, no, clearly the kiwi fruit industry is going to take 5 years to regenerate from this, and that's assuming that G3, the new variety, actually manages to maintain its sort of tolerance to PSA. There's no guarantees that that will happen.
Now, one of the most worrying aspects of the report apparently was that blood, semen and plant materials, apparently things that should be the utmost scrutinized, were not at all. How do we know that things are going to change? How do we know we're not going to get more lip service from the government?
I think the key is getting these government industry agreements working properly. The legislation's in place now under the Biosecurity Amendment Act, and industry needs to be prepared to take a real ownership role in what it's doing in terms of managing the biosecurity risks that it faces. And it needs to make the government accountable for doing its part. So it really needs industry and government to work much more closely together on biosecurity. And if there's ever a wake-up to both sides of the spectrum, as to the financial impact an incursion can have on an industry and the potential impact it has on the wider economy, this has got to be it. This is not foot and mouth. This is not the catastrophic event to the New Zealand economy, but it is a major event. And if we don't learn the lessons, we only set ourselves up for failure in the future.
Were you surprised to discover how lackadaisical, how trusting, if you like, Zespri was in not monitoring its own industry, just assuming government officials would take care of them?
I think that was the culture pre-PSA, not just in Zespri, but across the wider spectrum of New Zealand's industries. So we hadn't had a significant biosecurity issue for some time. We'd had a scare or two, but the major threat hadn't come. Varroa had come through, And I don't think that's ever been taken as seriously as it should have been taken.
No, and that came in 10 years ago. And some critics, some scientists are now saying that PSA could have been avoided for the kiwi fruit industry if they had changed the way they did business with varroa mite.
I think we've learnt the lessons now. I hope we've learnt the lessons. And I think it's time that we really, you know, it's not about the government throwing more money in. It's about using the money that we do put into biosecurity more effectively. And my view is we promote the concept of a levy on inbound travellers and inbound freight as a way of funding that proactive research. I think it's time to bring that idea back onto the table again and think about it.
Let's move on to ETS. We now know, as of last week, agriculture is going to be left out of the ETS picture until at least 2015. Good idea, bad idea?
Good idea.
How come?
ETS is a bad tax, and you know I've said that many times before. It's a tax that doesn't actually change behaviour, and it is a tax rather than a trading system that encourages the reduction of gases. So we haven't got the technology to reduce emissions in agriculture yet. We need to.
Nobody does.
No, and we need to, and we are investing in finding those sort of solutions. Until they're available, until there's the options, farmers can't actually reduce emissions. So why would we make ourselves uncompetitive in an international marketplace by imposing an extra charge on our farmers? It makes no sense at the current point in time.
The Greens still argue that international consumers want this to happen, and in fact that's why the Labour government put it in place. What do you say to that?
The Labour government put it in place, I think, to raise money, and that was the major driver of the charge. International consumers do want a sustainable product, but they don't view a sustainable product by the fact we have an ETS. They have a whole criteria, and we know because we talk to Walmart, we talk to Tesco's, we talk to a lot of the major players that are out there buying our products. They have their own criteria of what is sustainable production. Emissions control is only one part of that. They're looking for a whole range of ways as to the way we farm, the safety of our food, the efficacy of how we treat our animals, and they're the sort of criteria they're also wanting. So they do want us to do that, and we need to deliver that to them, but that's not being delivered by ETS. ETS is doing nothing to change behaviours. Westland
Dairy, now moving on to milk, has cut its 2012 pricing. What do you make of that?
Interesting. I think what it says is that there's probably more downward movements to come, not just from Westland, but across the spectrum of the dairy companies. I think market conditions are extremely tough at the moment. It's interesting, though, you know, the big question mark that's come up over the last 2 weeks is this heat wave in the Midwest of the US.
Yes, devastating,
devastating. Because what that's going to do is that's going to wipe out large tracts of corn and what's normal animal feed stocks right across the Midwest of North America. Obviously, that's going to put pressure on the costs of feed for dairy cattle in North America, not just in North America, across many other parts of the world as well. And what does that do to dairy supply? I think there'd been an assumption there was going to be a bit of a bubble of dairy supply coming through on the back of good prices a year or two ago. We may now see that some of those farmers decide that it's better to convert those dairy cows to beef and take the cash than continuing to farm them as dairy cows. So, you know, whereas I think we were looking at potentially a period of reasonably depressed dairy prices, other commodity prices are suddenly moving up very dramatically, and there's an expectation, I think, dairy prices might follow quicker than we'd expected.
Thanks, Ian. Coming up after the break, the China slowdown has companies and investors closely watching the world's second biggest economy. What are the global repercussions for Chinese demands for goods from the US, Europe, and other struggling economies? Is New Zealand missing out on opportunities in the global halal economy by concentrating on food exports and ignoring other avenues worth billions of dollars? A warning and a wake-up call from the New Zealand Asia Institute as an international conference gets underway in Auckland. But first, answer this in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. The PSA disease has devastated what was a $1.3 billion kiwi fruit export industry. How many of our orchards have been infected by PSA disease? The answer when we return. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you how many of our kiwi fruit orchards have been infected by PSA disease. As of last month, 1,226 orchards, or 37% of all of them, have been infected. Joining us now is Hugh Whittaker, Director of the New Zealand Asia Institute and Professor and Head of the Department of Management and International Business at the University of Auckland. Hugh has a PhD from Imperial College in London. He's done research at Harvard University and taught at Cambridge University for 12 years before setting up a business school and research institute in Kyoto at Doshisha University. Let me begin, Hugh, first by welcoming you to the show.
Thanks very much.
How do you think New Zealand businesses are doing generally when it comes to doing business with Asia?
I think we're doing very well in terms of commodities. The statistics show our exports to China are booming. I think they are largely commodities though, and we're not necessarily doing so well in our value-added products. We've done a survey in the business school at Auckland University called Growing New Zealand Businesses. And we found that the value-added products that we export tend to go to Europe and North America more, and companies which innovate tend to export to those countries more than Asia. And it's our non-innovators who tend to be focusing on Asia. So that's a source of concern for us. If we can do well in value-added as well as commodities, that would be good.
So, Ian, do you agree? Too much emphasis here on exporting commodities in New Zealand still, not enough on value-added products to Asia particularly?
I think there's definitely an argument that we're still sending far too much commodity product offshore. The challenge is we need to find the niches we can win in. We cannot send value products to the whole of the Chinese market or the whole of the Asian market. It's just too big. We can't supply those markets of those sort of size. So we need to be very focused on the areas we target. So is it baby food into a particular market, or is it a meat cut that's designed to work in a particular type of consumer requirement? I think we talk too much generically about sending value products, but we need to really understand where the niche is that we have something different, something that differentiates us and something people will pay a premium for, and then really target that hard.
Hugh, one of the areas that you want to talk about today is the halal economy around the world. And you're having a big international conference on Friday in Auckland. Who's coming and what are you going to talk about? A
number of people are coming from Malaysia who are involved in the halal food industry, and Malaysia is one of the centres of the halal food industry and indeed the halal economy. So we have a number of important people coming down from Malaysia and a number of people from Central Asia as well. The idea of the conference was originally, we called it Asia Dialogue, and we wanted to bring business people down from Asia to engage in a direct dialogue with business people in New Zealand to familiarise ourselves with each other's markets and customer preferences. I agree with Ian's statement that we need to focus, and Asia is a very broad concept, but we need to focus on particular markets and we need to know particular customer needs.
Well, I'm not a great expert on halal, but the message we get when we talk to people is there's a huge market opportunity in halal if we understand it properly. And I think, you know, the dialogue Hugh's talking about is exactly the sort of thing we need. The only way we actually meet exactly what our customers want and will pay a premium for is by getting down and talking to them and spending the time to understand their needs. So, you know, as I understand it, you look at Indonesia, it's the biggest Muslim country in the world. It has a huge demand. It's a very, very close country in terms of New Zealand. It's one of the closest major countries to us. And there's a huge demand for halal products, but not just the straight commodities. They're looking for value-add agricultural products as well as other solutions, particularly around the sort of quality of our food safety and food security standards. You know, that's very important for halal to maintain those standards, and we're world leaders in that space.
And if we get it wrong, or it's reported that we get it wrong, it could have devastating consequences. Tell me about what happened in Britain.
Last year there was a story that went out in the mainstream media about how all New Zealand meat was being processed for Muslims, and therefore would it be appropriate for the predominant Christian consumers to eat New Zealand produced product in the UK. We need to get the messaging right, that it's about safe food production standards, and it's also about ensuring that those standards meet the requirements of all our customers.
And I think you would tell us it's not just about food. We're missing out on all kinds of other opportunities. For example, IT. Tell me more.
Well, if you move out from food, you've got ingredients, you've got cosmetics, skincare products, right out to tourism, So it's a sensitivity to how other people look at the world and what their needs may be. And if we increase our sensitivity and understanding, then that will open up new opportunities for us. So it's not saying that we're only focusing on food and we're letting others drop. There are opportunities beyond meat, and they extend across the spectrum if we are aware and if we can engage in a dialogue of understanding what those opportunities might be.
What do Muslim societies like about New Zealand? What could we be exploiting better?
Well, I think in line with a lot of people in Asia, there's a favourable image of New Zealand, that it's clean and green. We don't always live up to it, but people have the hope and the expectation that New Zealand can live up to it. And visiting Southeast Asia and East Asia last year, I got a strong feeling that food security, food safety, those kind of issues are really high up on people's agendas. And if New Zealand could partner, could act in services and a whole range of activities to enhance food security, food safety in Asia, then I think the favourable image of New Zealand would be reinforced and we would get new business.
And yet I think most New Zealanders would say that we're already doing a pretty good job in that. Are there things we should be doing differently? Are there things we should be doing more of, Ian?
I think the key is we do food safety very well. We do some of the efficacy of production really well. What we're not doing is communicating that particularly well, so people don't necessarily understand it. They think about the clean green message, and that provenance story is one that we talk about in the agenda, but can be matched by many other countries. So you go to British Columbia and they've got a similar story, or you go to the Highlands of Scotland and there's a similar story about the clean green and the great environment and the rugged people and all that sort of thing. What we bolt onto that, and we need to bolt on much more explicitly, is we are the best in the world at food safety. We are the best in the world at animal care. We look after our environment, and you bring all that together into a package and sell it properly. I think that differentiates us, and that's a really important message, particularly in Asian markets. There is a bit of an assumption that that's not important to Asian consumers. Price is the key driver to Asian consumers. Everything we're hearing is completely consistent with what Hugh's saying, is the Asian market, food safety is the absolute paramount issue up there.
And they're willing to pay the price. If it's safe, they will pay the price.
And particularly they'll pay the price when it comes to feeding the kids.
Now, you've spent a lot of time in Japan. You helped set up a research institute, ran a business school there. What do we need to understand about the Japanese doing business so that we can get more of their money?
Well, we've been engaging with Japanese businesses for a long time, and Japanese investors have invested in a lot of New Zealand's food and agricultural sector. What Japanese people often think about New Zealand is that we have a superficial commitment to delivering goods and services when they're expected to be delivered, with the kind of care and consideration that Japanese consumers are used to. For us, roundabout good enough is good enough, but not for Japanese consumers or Japanese importers. So we often have to go that extra mile, and our businesses that have done that are prospering very well in Japan to this day.
Coming up after the break, future-proof on the highways and byways of the economic world as our experts point out what's coming up. But first, our agricultural debt has risen, according to statistics released by the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and it's at a record high. So answer this in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. How much is New Zealand's current agricultural debt? The solution when we return. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, how much is New Zealand's current agricultural debt? $47.9 billion. That's a record high, exceeding the $47.8 billion recorded in September 2010. Now, Hugh, one of the areas you think we could be doing much better in New Zealand is seafood and selling into the Asian markets. I thought we did a pretty good job.
Well, we sell a lot of commodity, frozen seafood into Asia. But what Asian consumers, particularly the kind of consumers you talked about who are willing to pay a lot of money, What they're looking for is seafood that is as fresh as when it came out of the sea. So there's a mismatch between what so-called high-end customers in Asia, who and we can access those customers through high-end supermarkets, through high-end restaurants and so on. What they want is a fresh product, a product that tastes as fresh as possible, preferably with a story around it, that they know is the traceability can be assured. And we tend to ship our frozen seafood off to China for processing and miss out, in my view, on an opportunity to move our seafood up into a high-end value-adding kind of industry.
Let's move to China now. Very briefly, reports out of there this week indicate that the economy continues to slow. That's going to be bad news for a lot of economies around the world, is it not?
Yeah, it's, I think that you can see just in the last couple of weeks, the Chinese government have started to put a couple of stimulus measures in place, and I think they're very worried about having a dramatic slowdown. And, you know, for China, dropping to 6% growth is a pretty significant slowdown.
Yeah, what kind of effect would that have around the world in other economies, Ian?
Well, I'm not sure quite how contagious it would be given the problems some of the other economies around the world have, but for our economy it would be a big issue, because we rely heavily at the moment on China for exporting our products to, and many of our other markets are not in the position to take as much as they've taken historically, particularly when you look at Europe and the problems it's got at the moment. So, you know, the whole world economy, I think, is teetering on an edge at the moment, and it could go either way. So I think how they sort out the problems in Europe and how they address Greece and Portugal and some of the challenges they've got there. Whether the US economy starts to see a little bit more of a sustained sort of pattern of growth. I think the reporting season we're going to see coming up in the next couple of weeks as people report their half-year results in the Northern Hemisphere is going to give us a pretty clear steer as to maybe where the economy is going long term, and it may not be positive news.
One of the things I've talked about with different guests over the months on this show is, you know, are we putting too many eggs in one basket when it comes to China? Look at what's happening now. There is a slowdown. Do we need to be developing the rest of Asia and Southeast Asia in particular? Hugh, what are your thoughts about that?
China obviously is still a very attractive market, but China is not insulated from the rest of the world. So if the rest of the world is in a slump, then China is also going to feel the effects, plus the effects that it had of trying to stop overheating in its own economy. Yes, we do have a certain amount of vulnerability. There are markets close to home in Southeast Asia. Our value-adding exports to Australia are increasing, so we obviously should be trying to mitigate our risk, but I wouldn't say that's a reason for forgetting about China. I think China is still enormously attractive, and parts of China are growing and will continue to grow.
Yeah, you can talk about having all your eggs in one basket. There's an argument, obviously, that dairy's putting too many of our eggs into one basket. You know, it's interesting, this week in Auckland, or coming up over the next week, we've got a conference here about engineered timber, and a global conference similar to the bringing people in to talk about halal. That's another key area. You know, we've got a huge opportunity with Christchurch to really profile how you can use engineered timber in a 21st century way and create a real market opportunity for our timber industry. It's our second biggest exporter, but we just send logs offshore. So why don't we really get in behind that and profile the opportunities, and government come on board and encourage, construction of government buildings in Christchurch to be done using a high degree of timber, actually showcase what we could do in New Zealand.
But why are we still even having this debate in 2012, Ian? I don't get it.
Well, we've got the opportunity at the moment, with what's happened in the last year in Christchurch, we can actually do something to really change our timber industry long term. And with this conference, that's maybe a good chance for the government to get on board and actually do something practical. Maybe we could rebuild the Christchurch Cathedral in timber. What a great idea. Why not? Why not create the world-leading timber building and position ourselves as the leader in that space? What do you think about that?
We are, in a sense, we're rebuilding it out of cardboard.
Yeah, we are, absolutely, absolutely.
And a Japanese architect is behind that. I think that's a real fascinating prospect. There's a chance of stimulating some new innovative kind of products and technologies in New Zealand, and I think we should grab it.
Thanks to my guests, Hugh Whittaker and Ian Proudfoot. Be sure to check out our website at country99tv.co.nz for the latest updates on rural developments here and abroad. Meantime, with those global dairy prices still rocky, I say we all need to get in behind and buy way more of this stuff. Hurry up! And while you're at it, put a splash more in your cuppa. It all adds up. Keep the faith. See you next time.